It started with a letter. A single, cream-colored envelope slipped into the mailbox on a quiet Tuesday morning. The kind that looked official before it was even opened. The return address bore the familiar logo of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association, embossed in gold and authority. For most people in the neighborhood, those envelopes were routine, reminders about dues, community updates, or thinly veiled warnings disguised as friendly notices. But for Marcus Hale, it marked the beginning of something far greater than a simple misunderstanding. It marked the start of a war. Marcus had lived in Maple Creek for nearly 6 years. His house sat at the corner of a deep sack, framed by oak trees and a small patch of garden he'd built himself. He wasn't flashy, didn't cause trouble, and paid his dues like everyone else. He worked as a contractor, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and his patience. But Maple Creek wasn't just any neighborhood. It was one of those places where appearances were everything, where lawns were trimmed like military haircuts and fences had to be painted in only 3 approved shades of beige. The HOA board treated its rules like scripture, and its president, Harold Jennings, saw himself as the neighborhood's high priest. When Marcus tore open that envelope, he expected something minor, maybe a notice about his trash cans being visible or a reminder to repaint his mailbox. Instead, it was a fine, $50. The letter claimed that he'd failed to remove nonconforming holiday decor after the designated deadline. Marcus blinked. The nonconforming decor in question. A single string of white LED lights that had been wrapped around his porch rail since Christmas. They weren't blinking, they weren't colored, and they certainly weren't offensive. He'd just forgotten to take them down. It would have been easy to pay it. A minor inconvenience, a small price to avoid conflict. But something about the tone of the letter unsettled him. It wasn't the fine itself. It was the wording, the implication that failure to comply could result in further action, including property lien procedures as outlined in Section 12, subparagraph 4C. That phrasing stuck with him. The HOA could file a lien over $50. That single sentence, buried halfway down the letter, sounded more like a threat than a reminder. Marcus placed the notice on his kitchen counter and stared at it for a long while. He'd heard rumors before. Stories about how Maple Creek's OA had bullied residents into paying excessive fees, threatened foreclosures, or demanded arbitrary repairs. But he'd never experienced it himself. Not until now. Over the next few weeks, the notices continued. A second one arrived marked delinquent. Then a third, with added late penalties. Each one used colder language, tighter phrasing, and more intimidating wording. By the end of the month, the HOA claimed that Marcus owed $243,000 in cumulative fines and administrative processing fees. He emailed the board, politely asking for an explanation. They responded with a short message directing him to their policy manual, an outdated PDF on the association's website, and warned that continued refusal to pay would result in legal action. That was when Marcus decided to dig deeper. He began attending HOA meetings, sitting in the back of the crowded clubhouse while Harold Jennings presided like a king at court. The board members nodded obediently to every word he said, and any homeowner who raised a complaint was met with the same dismissive phrase, "It's in the bylaws." But when Marcus read the bylaws himself, something caught his attention. Section 12, the one referenced in his notice, did indeed allow liens to be placed on delinquent properties, but only after certified notice of a confirmed violation hearing. Marcus had never been invited to one. No hearing had ever taken place. The HOA had skipped a required step. It was small, but legally it mattered. The more Marcus looked, the more he found. Financial records that didn't match, meeting minutes that skipped details, a community maintenance fund that had collected nearly $40,000 in the past year with no receipts to show where it went. It became clear that Maple Creek's OA wasn't just strict. It was sloppy, arrogant, and possibly corrupt. By the time spring came, the fines had grown to over $500. The HOA's final notice declared that unless payment was received, they would proceed with a lien and potential foreclosure. Over $50. Neighbors whispered about it quietly. Some pitied Marcus, others shook their heads, telling him to just pay and move on. But Marcus had already made his decision. This wasn't about $50 anymore. This was about principle, about fairness, about standing up to the people who thought they could control everyone through fear and paperwork. So he waited. He didn't pay. He didn't respond, and just as he expected, the HOA filed the lien. The paperwork came one morning in a thick envelope stamped with county records. An official noticed that Maple Creek Homeowners Association had placed a claim against his property. Marcus read every line of it. He studied the forms, the signatures, the legal citations, and by the time he reached the final page, a small, steady smile crossed his face. They'd made a mistake. The lien paperwork referenced an outdated bylaw number that had been replaced 3 years ago when the HOA updated its charter. That meant the lien was technically invalid. Worse, it was filed under false pretenses. It wasn't just unenforceable, it was illegal. Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't storm into meetings or threaten lawsuits. Instead, he spent weeks quietly gathering documents, requesting public financial disclosures, and digging through county property records. Each piece of paper told a story, and that story was ugly. Misused funds, improper filings, missing signatures. By the time summer arrived, Marcus had built a file so detailed it could dismantle the entire board. And that's when he found something else. Something buried deep in the county's property records. The HOA's clubhouse. The building they used for meetings, parties, and storage wasn't owned by the association at all. It was owned by a separate LLC, registered under the name Harold Jennings Properties. The HOA had been renting it using community funds to pay Harold directly. It was a quiet, legal loophole that funneled thousands of dollars to the man running the show. That was the moment Marcus knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to fight them in court. He wasn't going to argue at another meeting. He was going to take the one thing they valued most, the symbol of their power, the clubhouse itself. Marcus knew that the HOA was built on perception, a fragile illusion of order maintained by fear, paperwork, and silence. He'd seen how they operated. Threats came on letterhead, control came through procedure, and their greatest weapon wasn't power. It was the assumption that no one would ever question them. He intended to be the one who did. For weeks, Marcus worked quietly. His evenings were spent under the dim light of his desk lamp, surrounded by stacks of printed documents and highlighted bylaws. He combed through every line of Maple Creek's governing documents, every archived budget, every recorded transaction. It was tedious, meticulous work, the kind of slow grind that required patience most people didn't have. But Marcus did. The deeper he went, the clearer the pattern became. Maple Creek's HOA was bleeding its residents dry, not through overt theft, but through carefully disguised maintenance assessments and reserve allocations. Each year, Harold Jennings and his board approved new fees. Landscaping, lighting, repairs to the clubhouse. Yet none of it matched the spending records Marcus found in the county archives. Invoices were missing. Contractor names were fake. Bank transfers linked back to an account that wasn't listed under the HOA's name. It all pointed to the same thing, Harold's LLC, the one that owned the clubhouse. The HOA's payments for maintenance and rent were being funneled straight into it. On paper, it looked legitimate. In reality, it was self-dealing, an illegal conflict of interest. The community's money was being used to pay Harold himself. Marcus gathered evidence quietly, copying every document, saving every file. He was careful, methodical, and unseen. The board still thought he was just another disgruntled homeowner refusing to pay his dues. They had no idea what he was building behind the scenes. One night, while going through property records, he found something even more interesting. The LLC that owned the clubhouse had an outstanding loan. A balloon mortgage Harold had taken out years earlier to buy the property when the HOA was first established. It had been refinanced twice, but the current loan was nearing default. Payments were months behind. That changed everything. Marcus realized the HOA's clubhouse wasn't just a symbol of power. It was a liability. Harold had been using HOA fees to cover his own debt, and now that debt was collapsing. If the payments stopped, the property would go into foreclosure. And if that happened, anyone could buy it, even him. But first, Marcus needed confirmation. He filed a public request through the county's records department, asking for the latest deed and lien status on the clubhouse property. When the documents arrived, his suspicion was confirmed. A notice of pre-foreclosure had been filed 2 weeks earlier. The HOA didn't own its own headquarters. It was about to lose it. Marcus's plan began to take shape. He started by opening a small business entity under his own name, a generic-sounding company that could bid on local real estate. Then, he began tracking the foreclosure process through public notices. Every step had to be exact, every deadline met, every form filed properly. He wasn't just trying to win, He was trying to outsmart a system built to intimidate. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to escalate their attack. The board sent him letters warning that his delinquency would result in legal seizure of his home. They added late fees, processing charges, and legal costs, ballooning the total to nearly $2,000. Marcus received threats of small claims court, followed by official-looking legal drafts that were little more than bluffs. But none of it mattered anymore. While they focused on taking his home, he was quietly positioning himself to take theirs. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same people who lectured about responsibility and community standards were about to lose everything because of their own greed. As spring turned to summer, the tension around Maple Creek thickened. Rumors spread that the HOA's finances were under review. Some neighbors noticed that maintenance crews weren't showing up as often, that landscaping had slowed, that payments to vendors were being delayed. Harold, once smug and untouchable, began holding emergency meetings in private. Homeowners whispered, but few dared to question him openly. Then came the moment Marcus had been waiting for. A public notice was posted on the county website. The Maple Creek HOA clubhouse, officially listed under Jennings Holdings LLC, was scheduled for auction in 6 weeks. Starting bid $73,000. It was time. Marcus prepared meticulously. He reviewed the legal filings again, confirmed the ownership structure, and ensured that there were no hidden clauses tying the HOA's funds directly to the property's mortgage. When he was certain, he contacted a real estate attorney, explaining that he was interested in bidding anonymously through his company. The attorney handled the filings. Marcus handled the patience. For 6 long weeks, he stayed silent while the HOA continued its charade. They kept sending notices about his fines. They kept threatening foreclosure. Harold even mentioned at one meeting that they would set an example of Marcus Hale to prove the HOA's strength. He didn't know that the example was about to be him. The day of the auction arrived under an overcast sky. A few bidders gathered at the courthouse steps, clutching folders and envelopes. The clubhouse property wasn't glamorous. Just a single-story building with a meeting hall, a small office, and a patio used for neighborhood events. But to Maple Creek, it represented authority, control, power. When the auctioneer called the first bid, Marcus's attorney raised his hand. One by one, the others dropped out. The price climbed modestly, but not high enough to spark competition. When the gavel fell, the winning bid stood at $79,000. The property was sold to a small firm no one recognized. A week later, the paperwork was finalized. Marcus received the deed in the mail, plain, unassuming, stamped with the county seal. The clubhouse now belonged to him. The realization settled in slowly. The same building where he'd been fined, threatened, and lectured, the board's precious headquarters, was now under his name, legally, irrevocably. He didn't celebrate. Not yet. He knew what came next would require precision. The HOA still didn't know what had happened. For the next month, they continued holding meetings in the building, unaware that they were tenants in someone else's property. Harold still strutted through the clubhouse like a king in his castle. It was almost poetic. His empire already belonged to the man he'd tried to ruin. Marcus waited until the first rent invoice came due. The HOA received a formal notice in the mail, addressed to current occupant, demanding payment for continued use of the premises. Attached was a copy of the new deed, showing the property's transfer of ownership. Within hours, panic rippled through the neighborhood. Harold called an emergency meeting. Board members argued behind closed doors. The once invincible HOA had just learned that their headquarters, their foundation, no longer belonged to them. Marcus stood outside his house that evening, watching the lights flicker in the clubhouse windows. He didn't need to be inside to know what was happening. Everything they'd built on arrogance and intimidation was crumbling, and it had only just begun. The neighborhood had never felt quieter. Word about the clubhouse's ownership had spread through Maple Creek like a storm. For years, residents had walked past that stucco building believing it was theirs, a symbol of unity, of rules, of order. But now it stood as something else entirely. It was proof that the HOA wasn't invincible. It was proof that the man they tried to destroy had turned the tables. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't post online or brag to his neighbors. Instead, he let the silence do the talking. Every letter that arrived at the HOA's mailbox carried his new company's name in the corner. Every invoice they received reminded them who owned the ground beneath their feet. The board, however, refused to surrender easily. Harold Jennings called emergency meetings, his confidence cracking under pressure. He tried to rally the remaining board members, mostly his close friends and enablers, to come up with a solution. They discussed buying the clubhouse back, but the OA's reserves were drained. Their debts outweighed their liquid funds. The more they scrambled, the clearer it became that Marcus had outplayed them. Soon, homeowners began to question everything. If the board had lied about ownership, what else had they hidden? The whispered conversations that used to take place behind closed doors now spilled into the streets. People compared notes, noticed discrepancies in their HOA statements, and realized that many of their mandatory fees were nothing more than fabricated charges. The illusion of control had been shattered. For the first time, Marcus saw uncertainty in Harold's face. The man who had sent threatening letters, who once boasted about absolute authority, now looked smaller, a figure collapsing under the weight of his own ego. But Marcus wasn't finished. Not yet. He filed an official notice to terminate the OA's month-to-month occupancy of the clubhouse. It was a legal, calculated move, one that gave them 30 days to vacate the property or begin paying rent at market rate. When the notice arrived, it sent the board into chaos. They argued over the legality, trying to find loopholes, but the deed was ironclad. The property no longer belonged to them. When the 30-day mark arrived and no payment had been made, Marcus took the next step. His lawyer filed an eviction notice. The OA, the same organization that had threatened to seize his house, was now being evicted from theirs. The news spread beyond Maple Creek. Local residents, tired of HO corruption in their own neighborhoods, shared the story online. The headline alone was enough to draw attention. Homeowner evicts HOA after buying their clubhouse. Within days, the post went viral on social media. Reporters reached out for comment. Some praised Marcus as a hero. Others called him a troublemaker, but all agreed it was poetic justice. When a local news station arrived to cover the story, Marcus didn't seek the spotlight. He simply confirmed the facts. Yes, the HOA had fined him over a trivial $50 fee. Yes, they'd threatened his property. And yes, he now owned their headquarters. The footage showed the "For Lease" sign standing proudly in front of the building, the same building where he'd once been humiliated. Behind the sign, Harold tried to avoid cameras, but his frustration was visible in every frame. His empire had fallen publicly, and there was nothing he could do to hide it. The story became bigger than Maple Creek. Other homeowners from neighboring communities began to attend open HOA meetings, asking questions, demanding transparency. Marcus had sparked something larger, a quiet rebellion against abuse of authority. Yet, beneath the surface, he knew Harold wasn't done. Men like him rarely accepted defeat easily. Over the following weeks, strange things began to happen. Marcus's mailbox was tampered with. Anonymous complaints were filed against his property. Noise violations, trash citations, even claims that his grass was an inch too tall. Each accusation came from concerned residents, but Marcus knew who was behind them. Harold had lost his building, but not his bitterness. Still, Marcus refused to retaliate hastily. He documented everything: the false claims, the harassment, the OA's attempts to retaliate. Every letter they sent was added to a growing file that painted a damning picture of abuse and personal vendetta. When the eviction was finalized, Marcus invited the local reporter back to document the handover. Cameras rolled as movers carried out boxes of paperwork, banners, and office furniture. The once pristine clubhouse now stood empty, stripped of the arrogance it once held. Neighbors gathered outside, some cheering quietly, others just watching in disbelief. For years, they had lived under the HOA's control. Now they saw that control crumble in front of them. Harold tried to put on a brave face. He told anyone who would listen that it was just a temporary setback, that the HOA would rebuild, that they would find a new meeting space. But Marcus knew the truth. The board's credibility was gone. Without trust, no one paid their dues. Without dues, the HOA couldn't operate. By the end of summer, Maple Creek's HOA was effectively bankrupt. But Marcus wasn't motivated by destruction. He wasn't trying to burn everything down. He wanted change. Real change. So he began to talk with his neighbors. Calmly, respectfully, showing them the documents that proved what had really happened. People who once avoided him now listened. They realized he wasn't the villain the HOA had painted him to be. It took time, but slowly a new idea began to form. What if they rebuilt the community without Harold? What if the homeowners themselves took control, managing their neighborhood transparently and fairly? No hidden fees, no threats, no power games. Just honest cooperation. By fall, Marcus had gathered enough support to petition for a full OA election. The bylaws required a 60% homeowner vote to trigger it, and he achieved nearly 80%. Harold was blindsided. The man who had ruled Maple Creek for years with intimidation was now facing a democratic uprising from the very people he'd exploited. The vote was set for early October. Marcus didn't campaign loudly. He didn't promise revenge or power. He promised fairness, transparency, the kind of leadership that treated neighbors like neighbors, not subjects. When election day came, the turnout was the highest in the community's history. Ballots were cast, counted, and sealed in front of witnesses. When the final results were read aloud, Harold Jennings and his entire board were officially removed from power. Marcus Hale was elected as the new HOA president. It was a quiet victory, not celebrated with cheers, but with relief. The kind of victory that comes when justice finally settles like calm after a storm. Standing in the now empty clubhouse, his clubhouse, Marcus thought back to the beginning. The 50 fee, the threats, the arrogance, it had all led to this. But deep down, he knew the story wasn't finished. Harold Jennings wasn't the type to disappear quietly. And in the weeks to come, Marcus would learn just how far Harold was willing to go to get his revenge. Peace in Maple Creek was always temporary. After the election, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. The air was lighter, the streets quieter, and the people, once afraid to speak, finally talked openly. They shared stories about late fees that had appeared out of nowhere, property warnings that were never justified, and threats that had gone too far. For the first time in years, neighbors felt heard, and Marcus Hale had become the symbol of that change. But under the surface, something darker was forming. Harold Jennings may have been removed from office, but he wasn't removed from Maple Creek. He still owned a home there, the same 2-story corner property he'd bragged about during every board meeting. And while Marcus and the new board began rebuilding trust, Harold was quietly rebuilding resentment. The first signs were small. A few residents received anonymous flyers in their mailboxes, poorly printed pamphlets accusing the new HOA board of mismanagement, illegal elections, and personal profit. The language was oddly familiar. Then came the social media posts, fake accounts claiming to be concerned homeowners, spreading rumors that Marcus had staged the entire election to seize power. Screenshots circulated, half-truths twisted into believable lies. Marcus ignored it at first. He knew Harold's tactics, the manipulation, the half-smile, the way he'd twist words until people doubted what they'd seen themselves. But this time, something felt more deliberate. Within a month, anonymous complaints started arriving at the county office. Someone claimed Marcus's new HOA was mishandling funds. Another alleged that his deed to the clubhouse property had been fraudulently acquired. County inspectors began showing up unannounced, asking questions, reviewing documents, searching for mistakes that didn't exist. Each time, Marcus provided proof. Everything was clean, transparent, and legally sound. But the harassment was taking its toll. He began noticing a black SUV parked near his property late at night, no plates visible, just sitting there, lights off. His mailbox was vandalized again. One morning, he found a single word scratched into the side of his fence: TIF. The old HOA might have been gone on paper, but Harold had resurrected it in whispers and shadows. Still, Marcus refused to let fear win. He poured himself into rebuilding Maple Creek from the inside out. Under his leadership, the new HOA became something different, a cooperative. Fees were lower, decisions were public, and every homeowner had a vote that actually mattered. The community flourished. Lawns that had once been neglected out of spite were cared for again. Families gathered at the clubhouse, no longer a symbol of authority, but a hub for weekend barbecues, meetings, and movie nights. Even the most skeptical residents started to believe in something they'd forgotten long ago, that a neighborhood could exist without fear. But peace, as always, was fragile. One afternoon, Marcus received a letter from the county recorder's office, an official notice of a lawsuit filed against him and the HOA. The plaintiff, Harold Jennings. The claim was absurd. Harold alleged that the transfer of the clubhouse property had been fraudulent, that Marcus had exploited a loophole and illegally profited from community assets. It was a desperate attempt, but a clever one. If the court even entertained the idea, it could drag the case out for months, maybe years. Marcus's attorney reviewed the filing and sighed. The paperwork was messy but strategic. Harold wasn't trying to win. He was trying to exhaust Marcus, to bleed him dry through legal fees, delays, and stress. But Marcus had prepared for this. Every step of his revenge had been documented, notarized, and archived. The sale, the transfer, the eviction, all airtight. When the court hearing arrived, Harold came in wearing his usual smugness, carrying binders filled with irrelevant documents. He spoke passionately about betrayal and community theft, trying to convince the judge that Marcus had orchestrated everything for personal gain. But the evidence told another story. Every letter Harold had sent, every unlawful fine, every threat to seize Marcus's house, all of it was entered into record. By the time Marcus's attorney finished presenting the timeline, the courtroom fell silent. The pattern was clear. Harold's crusade against Marcus had been driven by ego and retaliation, not justice. The judge dismissed the case in under 20 minutes. Harold left without a word, but his expression said everything. It wasn't defeat. It was humiliation, the kind of humiliation that festers, that grows into something dangerous. After that day, Harold vanished for a while. The SUV stopped appearing. The flyers disappeared. The neighborhood breathed again. Marcus began to hope that maybe, finally, the storm had passed. But storms, he would learn, don't end that easily. It started again 2 months later. A fire, small but deliberate, broke out near the clubhouse. It was extinguished quickly, but investigators confirmed it had been started intentionally. There were no suspects, no witnesses, and no cameras. Then came the letters, not from Harold directly, but from a newly formed residents group, claiming to represent the true Maple Creek community. Their tone was accusatory, venomous, and familiar. They demanded the reinstatement of the original HOA charter and called for Marcus's resignation. This time, Marcus didn't ignore it. He traced the group's name through online registration records, following the digital trail. What he found made his stomach tighten. The website had been created by a single user, Harold Jennings. Marcus realized that Harold wasn't just bitter. He was obsessed. And that obsession was about to reach its breaking point. Late one evening, Marcus received a call from a neighbor near Harold's property. There were moving trucks outside. Harold, it seemed, was leaving Maple Creek. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. But Marcus had a sinking feeling this wasn't the end. Not yet. He walked outside that night and looked toward the old corner lot. Harold's house. The windows were dark, the driveway empty, the air still. But even from across the street, Marcus could feel it. That uneasy tension that lingers when something unfinished hovers between victory and vengeance. He had won every battle so far. The fines, the clubhouse, the presidency, even the lawsuit. But Harold Jennings was not a man who accepted defeat, and in the silence of that empty house, Marcus knew the final confrontation was coming. He just didn't know how far Harold would go to take everything back. Winter came early to Maple Creek that year. The frost clung to rooftops, lawns shimmered with white, and the streets that once buzzed with gossip now felt still, almost watchful. The neighborhood had changed since Harold's downfall, but his shadow hadn't vanished. It lingered quietly, a ghost behind every fence and window. Marcus had learned to live with it. He carried on with his life, focusing on rebuilding the community, planning the spring renovations for the clubhouse, and setting up new initiatives that gave homeowners real input. The neighborhood that had once feared its board was now thriving under transparency and fairness. But Marcus had grown cautious. He checked his locks twice at night. He reviewed every piece of mail that arrived. Trust had become a fragile concept, one he didn't extend easily anymore. It had been nearly 3 months since anyone had seen Harold Jennings. His house sat dark, the lawn overgrown, mail piling up near the door. Rumor had it he'd moved to Florida. Others whispered that he'd gone bankrupt, selling off assets to pay for his legal losses. Marcus didn't believe any of it. Harold wasn't the kind of man who vanished quietly. Then, one frigid morning in late January, Marcus found something unusual taped to the clubhouse door. A faded notice, printed on official-looking letterhead. It was a cease and desist order addressed to the HOA, claiming the clubhouse was still under dispute. The letterhead bore the name of a law firm Marcus recognized immediately, the same firm Harold had used during the last lawsuit. It was the first real sign that Harold had returned. At first, Marcus laughed it off. The previous court ruling had been definitive, the judge's decision was final. There was no legal dispute left to fight. But later that week, county officials showed up again, this time with a new complaint, alleging unauthorized alterations. to the clubhouse property. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Harold was back, but this time, his approach was different. He wasn't attacking Marcus directly. He was undermining everything Marcus had built. False complaints poured in weekly zoning violations, environmental concerns, noise citations from events that never happened. Each accusation forced Marcus to defend the new HOA, to prove again and again that their actions were lawful. Behind the scenes, Harold's residents group had re-emerged, gaining traction among a small but vocal minority. They accused Marcus of being a dictator in disguise, of creating a shadow OA that operated outside the community's best interests. It was the same fear Harold had used years ago, weaponized once more. The tension grew. At every community meeting, the tone shifted from gratitude to suspicion. Neighbors who once supported Marcus began questioning him. Not because of anything he'd done, but because Harold's lies were crafted to sound just plausible enough. Then came the breaking point. One cold February night, a group of residents arrived at Marcus's door, holding a printed petition. They demanded that he step down as HOA president, citing ethical concerns. Marcus stood in silence, watching faces he'd once trusted, people he'd helped defend, now turning against him. When he asked where they got their information, one of them hesitated before admitting Harold had returned and was offering to take back control, to restore order. It was exactly what Harold wanted. Chaos disguised as leadership. Marcus didn't argue. He simply stepped back, thanked them for coming, and closed the door. That night, he couldn't sleep. The betrayal stung, but what burned deeper was the realization that Harold had learned how to win without authority. He was manipulating people from the outside, poisoning the community Marcus had rebuilt. The next morning, Marcus went to the clubhouse early. The air was thick with fog, the streets silent. When he arrived, something immediately felt wrong. The door was slightly open, the lock damaged. Inside, the smell of gasoline hung in the air. He froze. The walls were streaked with black soot near the kitchen area. Someone had tried, and failed, to start another fire. The damage was minimal, but the message was unmistakable. On the table sat a small, crumpled envelope. Inside was a single photograph, an old picture of Marcus standing in front of his house, taken years ago during the first HOA dispute. Written across the bottom, in jagged pen strokes, were 3 words: "You took mine." Marcus didn't need a signature to know who sent it. He reported the break into the police, who opened an investigation, but there was little evidence to trace. No fingerprints, no cameras, no witnesses. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. Still, Marcus refused to back down. Instead, he did something Harold didn't expect. He went public again. He reached out to the same reporter who had covered his earlier victory and told her everything. The harassment, the false claims, the break-ins, the ongoing manipulation. The story aired 2 days later. The headline read, "Former President under investigation after retaliation against homeowner who exposed corruption." It spread fast. Within hours, local authorities began looking deeper into Harold's past activities. The illegal fines, the fabricated fees, even the misuse of HOA funds that had gone unpunished. Neighbors who had doubted Marcus began to see the truth again. They realized they'd been manipulated. Support for the residents' group evaporated overnight, leaving Harold isolated. But Marcus knew Harold wouldn't surrender quietly. Late one evening, as rain poured against the windows, Marcus sat in his office going through paperwork when headlights swept across his driveway. He looked up and saw a familiar black SUV stop just beyond the gate. The engine idled for a moment before the vehicle slowly reversed and disappeared into the darkness. Harold was still out there, watching, waiting, planning. Marcus knew this would end only one way. Harold wasn't interested in negotiation or redemption. He wanted victory, no matter the cost. And as the weeks passed, the tension in Maple Creek reached its breaking point. One night, a neighbor called Marcus in a panic. Harold had been spotted sneaking around the clubhouse property again, carrying what looked like fuel cans. By the time police arrived, he was gone, leaving behind scorch marks in the grass and a half-burned pile of HOA documents. It was enough. Marcus filed a restraining order the next morning, and law enforcement finally took notice. A warrant was issued, and within a week, Harold Jennings was arrested for trespassing, vandalism, and attempted arson. The news broke like wildfire. The once feared HOA tyrant was now a public disgrace, facing charges in the same county where he'd once ruled over homeowners with intimidation and arrogance. When the police led him away in handcuffs, the neighborhood gathered quietly along the sidewalk watching. No one spoke. There were no cheers, no jeers, just silence. The kind of silence that marks the end of a long, bitter war. Marcus watched from his porch. The man who had tried to destroy him, over $50, was finally gone. But as the sirens faded and the crowd dispersed, Marcus didn't feel victorious. He felt empty. Because revenge, when it finally arrives, never feels the way you imagine. It doesn't heal the wounds. It just stops the bleeding. And though Maple Creek was finally free, Marcus knew the scars of what had happened there would never fully disappear. The trial was brief but unforgettable. It lasted less than a week, but in those few days, the entire history of Maple Creek was laid bare for everyone to see. The courtroom filled with neighbors. Some seeking closure, others silently reckoning with their own guilt for standing by during Harold's reign. The charges against him were clear. Attempted arson, trespassing, destruction of property, and a long list of financial misconduct that had finally caught up with him. When the verdict was read, the tension that had gripped the community for years seemed to melt away. Harold Jennings was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison, along with restitution payments to the HOA and the homeowners he'd wronged. Marcus sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, listening to the words that marked the end of an era. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply exhaled, a long, quiet breath that carried years of stress, anger, and sleepless nights. The man who had once towered over him, who had weaponized rules and regulations to destroy others' peace, was now powerless, trapped in the same system he had abused. After the trial, the neighborhood began to heal in small, almost imperceptible ways. The once feared HOA board meetings became open forums for discussion, laughter, and planning. The air around Maple Creek felt lighter. Not free of tension, but calmer, grounded. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years began reconnecting. Marcus focused on rebuilding the community not through control, but through cooperation. The fines were gone. The petty citations disappeared. The HOA's budget, once bloated with unnecessary fees, was now directed toward things that mattered. Better lighting, repaired sidewalks, and a small community garden near the lake. The lake itself had become symbolic for Marcus. Once obstructed, fenced, and hidden behind Harold's walls, it now reflected open skies and free winds. On quiet mornings, Marcus often walked there with a coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the calm water. It reminded him why he had fought, not for revenge, but for peace. Yet, peace came with reflection. Marcus often thought about how it all started. A single $50 fine, a meaningless sum that spiraled into years of conflict, loss, and chaos. He realized it wasn't really about money at all. It had never been. It was about control, about pride, and about what happens when power goes unchecked. For Harold, that $50 had been a test, a way to see if Marcus would bow to the HOA's authority like everyone else had. When he didn't, Harold's obsession began. It was never about the rules, it was about winning. And in the end, that obsession had cost Harold everything. Marcus didn't take joy in his downfall. In fact, he found himself pitying the man who had spent his life enforcing control only to lose it all because of his own arrogance. Harold had built his identity around the HOA, and when it was gone, there was nothing left of him but bitterness. Months passed, seasons turned. Spring arrived again, painting the streets with color and warmth. The houses, once uniform under Harold's rigid codes, began to show individuality again. A blue mailbox here, a flower garden there, wind chimes on porches that had once been forbidden. Maple Creek was becoming a neighborhood again, not a battleground. Marcus spent his weekends helping with projects, repainting fences, organizing cleanup drives, and teaching new homeowners how the reformed HOA worked. He no longer saw himself as a leader but as a steward, a caretaker of something fragile but beautiful. Then, one morning, as he sorted through his mail, Marcus found an envelope with no return address. His heart skipped for a moment, old instincts firing. He carefully opened it, half expecting another remnant of Harold's chaos. Inside was a short note, handwritten in a shaky but familiar scrawl. It read, "You won, Marcus. Take care of what I couldn't." There was no signature, but Marcus didn't need one. He sat at his desk for a long time, the letter in his hand, trying to understand what it meant. Perhaps Harold had written it before going to prison. Perhaps he had finally recognized the futility of his fight. Whatever the truth was, Marcus decided to take it not as a threat, but as closure. the final echo of a man who had spent too long in the wrong kind of war. He folded the note carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That summer, the community came together to dedicate a small park near the lake. They named it Freedom Park, a simple gesture symbolizing the end of years of control. A local artist painted a mural on one of the clubhouse walls, a bright, colorful depiction of Maple Creek's rebirth, featuring homes surrounded by trees, sunlight, and open skies. At the dedication, Marcus stood quietly among his neighbors, watching children run across the grass, their laughter echoing through the air that once carried nothing but tension. He thought about how far they had all come, from fear to freedom, from silence to unity. The HOA that once took homes was now giving them back, in spirit, if not in deed. And for Marcus, that was victory enough. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus walked down to the lake one last time. The water shimmered gold beneath the fading light. A gentle breeze rippled across its surface, stirring the reflection of his home, the same house that had once been at the center of everything. He thought of the letter again of Harold's words, and whispered to himself a quiet truth he had learned through all the chaos. Control can build walls, but compassion builds communities. And Maple Creek had finally learned the difference. As he turned to leave, the wind carried the soft rustle of leaves and the faint laughter of his neighbors behind him. For the first time in years, Marcus felt at peace, not because he had won, but because the fight was finally over. The HOA had tried to take his house over $50, but in the end, he had taken back something far greater: his freedom, his home, and the soul of a community that would never be the same again.